Thank you very much for joining us today.
Pleasure.
It's a pleasure to have you here on The Interviewer. It's widely accepted that we are in this post-truth era, but what do you think that means for journalists? How should they respond to that?
Well, I think one of the difficult things for journalists is that they traditionally have grown up through a tradition of evidence-based reporting and facts and open debate, rational debate, and so on. And we're in an era at the moment where, for a complicated variety of reasons, many people are paying less attention to those sort of traditional ways of doing journalism, if you like. I mean, those all kind of stem from the Enlightenment originally, a kind of rational approach to it. And these days there's much more of an emotional kind of affinity with certain sorts of argument, where actually whether it's the literal truth or not matters less for many people than perhaps journalists traditionally think it ought to. So that makes it very difficult for them to engage because they're talking a different language. So, for example, people criticised a lot of what Donald Trump said during his election campaign, but some of his campaign team would say, well, you take him too literally. He's really just talking in hyperbole. He's kind of creating a kind of mood and a feeling which people can emotionally associate with and support, and you shouldn't take him quite so literally. And of course, for journalists whose bread and butter and whose currency is evidence and facts, that's a very difficult thing to do.
What do journalists do when they're met with someone, perhaps like Michael Gove during the Brexit referendum campaign, and he was saying that we don't want to hear from experts anymore? What does the journalist do now at that point when the individual doesn't even want to hear the facts?
Well, I think there's two things about it. I mean, firstly, I think journalists and the media need to try to understand what Michael Gove was saying there, which isn't perhaps literally to say that expertise doesn't matter anymore, but what he is saying is, if you like, economists' predictions and the kind of technocratic approach to managing public life is something that many parts of the public, many people in the country have got fed up with because it's not delivering for them. So journalists need to understand that there's a frustration. He's expressing a frustration which is shared by many people, but equally expertise does matter, and they need to continue to undertake evidence-led journalism and holding people to account.
But what about impartiality? Journalists are always, held up as beacons of neutrality, perhaps, not favouring one side. But do you think that could be almost a limiting factor for journalists as they try to challenge people who have these stringent views?
Well, of course, some journalists have always tried to be impartial or objective, and indeed some journalists, broadcast journalists in the UK, are regulated and have to be. But it's equally true that many journalists have never been impartial or objective, and particularly some newspapers have always been at a very clear political position, and their news coverage always supports that political position. So, I think the kind of impartiality and objectivity points get a little bit misunderstood. That's the first thing. Secondly, I think the criticism around impartiality is often misunderstood. People say, it's journalists pretending they don't have personal opinions, and of course they do, so they're trying to hide their real agendas, and they need to be more open. Actually, that's not what impartiality is. Impartiality was a professional discipline that was introduced when journalism started to grow 100 plus years ago, precisely to recognise that journalists do have personal opinions, and it was a discipline, a process to try to discount that. So, always get the other side of the story, get two sources. It was a set of disciplines trying to raise the quality of information, and it wasn't to pretend you don't have opinions. It was to acknowledge you probably do have personal opinions and to get past them, as it were. So people need to understand what impartiality and objectivity are about, and they are much misunderstood. But also recognise we've always lived in a world where there have been large sections of the media which haven't subscribed to that. And I think increasingly going forward, looking forward a bit more, actually the fact that broadcasting in Britain is regulated to be impartial ought to increasingly become a differentiating factor, because it means that broadcasting is accountable and transparently accountable in a way that newspapers aren't, and in a way that online media isn't. And actually, if people are starting to get lost in this post-truth era of knowing what to believe and what not to believe, broadcasting is accountable in a way that other parts of the media aren't, because it's regulated for impartiality.
Okay, let's move on to fake news. Should we be concerned about fake news and its potential impact?
Well, I think it's a short to medium term issue, if I'm honest. So firstly, there's always been fake news. So, you know, in the 1970s, the National Enquirer said Elvis was alive and living on the moon or something, you know. The Sun ran the headline, Freddie Starr ate my hamster, you know, he hadn't ate a hamster, you know. So there's always been fake news kind of for entertainment, I suppose, and by and large people have recognised that. So what's changed are two or three things. Firstly, it's a lot easier to make content which gets into the public domain now, thanks to the internet and social media. You know, before the internet, you had to have a printing press or a radio mast in order to be able to produce it. Now, you know, all you need is a laptop. So that's become a lot easier. So there's a much more of this kind of stuff going around. And secondly, there are new incentives. So, you know, in the polarising politics that we're seeing in America and in the UK and in parts of Europe, there are political incentives to try to, you know, drive emotion and opinion into a certain political direction around support around a particular argument. So that's certainly something that we've seen, and because it's much easier to produce that material, we're seeing a lot more of it. But also the economics of the internet actually reward sensation and speed. So if you produce, it's clickbait, so if you produce a really sensational headline, it'll get people to click on it and you'll make money, and it doesn't matter whether it's true.
But in light of that, who do you think should be held responsible for fake news? You know, who should be in charge of regulating it, especially on the internet?
Well, you can't regulate the internet, so I don't think you can try to do that. Really, I mean, some people think they should try and regulate Facebook. I think it's a hopeless cause. But I think there's, you know, three things. Firstly, the people who produce it. So the question is, can you remove the incentives for them? And that's part of what Facebook and Google are doing, are trying to make sure that you know, they don't get a lot of money for producing rubbish content. I think there is some responsibility for the platforms and the distributors like Facebook. They have to realise that actually a piece of serious political journalism is not just a commodity like a cat video, that it needs to be weighted differently, and actually, given the scale of their operations and the impact that they have on public debate and public discussion, they need to take some responsibility for that. And at the minute they're denying responsibility. Oh, we're just a technology company, we don't have, you know, what people put on their websites, nothing to do with us. Well, that's not good enough given their scale. So they need to recognise they have a responsibility to try and help manage that rather better than they have. But finally, I think it's about media literacy, and I think in the end we need to teach people to understand better the kinds of information that they consume and where it comes from, and to understand different sorts of information and why something from a reputable source can be trusted where something from a website name that you've never heard of probably can't. And you know, at the minute the media has raced ahead so fast, particularly social media, that people have been left behind and don't really understand the qualitative differences in the kinds of content that they consume. So that's a media literacy issue, which is a long-term educational issue, really.
But on that point, a lot of these fake news websites tend to have very similar names, almost similar web domains. Yeah. So for even someone who perhaps is well versed in media literacy, you know, it can still be difficult for them to differentiate between fake and real. So how do people do
Well,
that?
I think it is difficult, and you're right. A lot of these sites try to deliberately mislead people, but that's why this media literacy education matters. And you know, we've probably all been caught out at one point or another. I've certainly been caught out occasionally by them because they're so cleverly manufactured and made to look legitimate. But again, it means that people need to understand, perhaps they need to think twice, perhaps they need to double check what the URL is before sharing it and saying, you know, believing it. And alongside these other initiatives, the fact-checking initiatives, the flagging issues, the technology platform issues and so on, you know, I think we will start to see it, you know, fade away a little bit because the incentives are going to change.
Do you think, in light of all the things we've spoken about, that more than ever today there is a big pressure on journalists to create quality news, quality reporting, to combat everything within the post-truth era and that comes from fake news?
I think there's going to be a need for greater clarity both by the public and by journalists about what kind of business they're in. And if you work for certain newspapers, you're actually in the propaganda business, actually, you probably always have been. If you work for other newspapers, you're in the serious news business. If you work for a broadcaster, you're in the regulated news business. So these are all different, and people tend to lump it all as the media. Actually, the media is, you know, many different kinds of businesses and many different kinds of things, and I think both the public and people entering the media and journalists need to be a bit more clear-sighted about what it is that they're involved in and not try and blur the edges and pretend it's all the same thing, because they're very, very different activities.
Okay, that's been very interesting to talk to you. Thank you very much for joining us.
Pleasure.